Hello everyone, today we briefly introduce the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Michael III. We already made other videos about Macedonian emperors, however we never introduced the broader period as such, and I think that with the beginning of the dynasty we can take the chance of doing so. So we're looking at essentially the acme of Byzantine power, at least to some extent. This is debatable, of course, but we're talking medieval times, the High Middle Ages. Definitely Constantinople achieves an unprecedented level of, especially of compactness of power, considering also the peoples that surround the empire that are also threatening, right? Problems never go away as far as that is concerned, but there is an important re-expansion. We're talking 843 to 1025, right? This is a period marked by the presence, of course, of the Macedonian dynasty that wasn't, however, fully continuous. We've seen it with other emperors, but this is the point, the mere fact that this family and essentially managed to maintain formally the right to the throne and powerful as invasive regencies still proves how sound, after all, the Byzantine statal base of power was, how successful it had been to, and the way it was remolded to some extent in the previous centuries to withstand especially the Islamic invasions that risked to wipe out the same empire. 717 Constantinople is something more momentous than Poitiers, 732. We will talk about both battles as a matter of fact. And again, in many ways, the Macedonian era as a whole can be considered the moment of major flourishing of the empire. There is also another important problem that is settled, allowing this dynasty to consolidate further. That is the one of the great religious clashes started by the iconoclasm. This allowed internal rest and also a strong revival of Byzantine expansion, reconquest, that manifested, as we've seen also in other videos about, I don't know, the one Nicephorus, Photius, and others, would manifest especially in the 10th century, right? In parallel to this, you have the overall absence of major internal contrasts, even though there were some forces that definitely were potentially destructive, but the center, especially Constantinople as a city, becomes a sort of state within the state. In many ways, it creates its own Constantinople as an army to deter what had been historically like the provincial attempts of usurpation in the capital by the local thematic armies. So you don't see much of that clash between counterposed sides, and in general, even when this happens, Constantinople remains the center, so that is a stabilizing factor that surely comes at the expense of important autonomies, but it was also in many ways necessary, and just you can date back to Constantinian times, essentially the part of the reasons why that city had been chosen as the overall center of this enormous territory. And to this positive element, we add, in fact, essentially an economic solidity, also political stability, as we just said, was only in part undermined by the development of the estate of the great landowners. Right, this is an important theme in Macedonian history, because tendentially the dynasty pushed for the maintenance of what had been the older Roman statal centralized model, countering what was all around Constantinople, and in part within the same Byzantine Empire, occurring as essentially a proto-feudal trend, right? The increased privatization was eroding public authority, etc. I made multiple videos recently, one about the Byzantine tributary system, for example. In many ways, the imperial balance of power depended on these dynamics. So there is a necessity also to call these great landowners, not to discontent them too much. But this also passes, as we were saying before, through the affirmation of a renewed military power that is on the battlefield and beyond, marked by the particularly fortunate wars against the Arabs in the East. Also, the final subjection, as you know, made multiple videos about Basil II of the Bulgarian Empire, First Bulgarian Empire. And finally, we will see it partly also today for Michael III, the cultural flourishing, right? What we see during the later Middle Ages as a distinctively Byzantine culture in many ways, yes, dated back to all the basis of this empire historically, culturally, ethnically, but it was molded in a slightly sclerotic way, telling the truth at this point, not so, say, fluid and dynamic and sort of capable of dating like in Justinian's times, but in fact in a still very powerful way, and mirroring the new order that had affirmed itself after these centuries of, again, of great let's say, inner reflection in some ways, forced by the circumstances, by the loss of large swaths of the empire, the necessity of building on the local basis to survive regionally, rather than just pursuing the universal dream only, but in fact being quite aware of the original mission of the ecumenic empire, right? And so all the enormous cultural baggage that Constantinople had been able to preserve over the centuries. This is not, again, the video to simply discuss this. We have a pretty hefty Byzantine playlist by this point, but we will have to come back on each and every one of these topics. In any case, we find this cultural flourishing definitely expressed in the revival of higher education and literary production during the 9th and the 10th century in particular. Speaking of the reign of Michael III, it is sort of a, let's say, not necessarily underrated emperor, but one on whom sort of a negative picture by the following historiography sort of was created on, and that instead has been reevaluated historiographically to an important extent, right? And at least many important things happened under his reign, right? Michael came actually from the Amorian dynasty, and he would rule between 842 and 867. He was the young son of the previous ruler, Theophilus. The boy had initially remained under his mother's tutelage, as well as the one of her major counselor, that was the Logothetus Theoctistus. And the figure of Michael III passed down in history in a very negative way, as we were saying before. The drunkard, for example, also his sexually debauched customs that probably weren't actually, and this is all the product of an adverse historiography, right? And when you look at his reign, you realize that at least this was one of the most important periods in Byzantine history, and many of which were also, of course, connected with the emperor's rule and government. We can appreciate, for example, the military accomplishments achieved in Anatolia against the Arabs. The Arabs were attacked by the Byzantines in 863. Petronas, the leader of the imperial army, was the brother of Bardas, that was Michael's uncle, that had maintained, in fact, a very high office at the court. And Petronas was also the strategos of the theme of Thrace. The Byzantine army scored in the same year an important pitched battle victory against the Emir of Melitene in the Anatolian southeastern frontier, quite a strategic post. The Emir was killed in combat, and with this, that you have the Byzantine takeover and the beginning, in fact, of the great counteroffensive, the wider counteroffensive of the empire that would last basically until the following century. And this is a very important turning point in Byzantine history, in perspective, because up to that point, the Byzantines had maintained a fundamentally defensive attitude towards Islam, right? Since the 7th century, the empire had to defend from the Muslims. At this point, you have really the full coming back, and with that, in fact, a remarkable series of victories that witnessed sort of the substance, not just the form of this empire. And it's important to look at the other side as well, because the Islamic empire definitely had lost its initial cohesion, elan. I made some videos about, say, the caliphate as a whole, and a bit of caliphal history is needed more in perspective here. But you realize that in spite of this, isolated expansionistic successes that did keep occurring after the first wave of the Islamic invasions, what happened in the Muslim world was essentially the triggering of a process of decadence that would have been also more evident during the 10th century. So I'll try to make the long story short. We start from the beginning. Of course, the death of Muhammad in 632 had brought the caliphs to attain supreme power, right? These had carried out the, say, heroic phase of the expansion that culminated with the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, of the Visigothic kingdom, and the swarming, in fact, in Western Europe, starting from 711. The siege of Constantinople in 717 that we were remembering before, then they had been beaten, both, in fact, on the Bosphorus on that occasion, and at the Battle of Tours/Poitiers of 732 by the Franks of Charles Martel. We surely have to talk more about Frankish warfare, Frankish-Arab one in this context, especially. Never talk about the Battle of Tours, but it's one of those, epic pages for good. Of course, it was the Battle of Acroinos further in the east that is sort of forgotten, but it was as important as Poitiers, for not talking about the siege of Constantinople, but here we're not making comparisons for this video, at least. That can be an interesting theme for another one. And definitely these defeats had represented an important, say, hold in this various expansionistic direction. You have Islam stretching from the Indus to to the Atlantic. But in 750, you get first of all, the end of the Umayyad Caliphate had been instituted in Damascus in 661, carried out by the Abbasid clan that led to this first split between, in fact, the Abbasid Caliphate settled basically in Baghdad, in Mesopotamia, very influenced also by the Persians, for that matter, even though the Shia Sunni division had already been carried out, but at times the same Abbasids could become Shias, especially under Al-Mamun, that is around, in fact, the same time. We will mention it later. And arrival and initially emirate, right, of the Umayyads of Spain that we talked about a bit more often, constituted in 756, that would become caliphate in its own regard in the beginning of the 10th century. Is not so important, but to say, of course, that the universal integrity of Islam had been over, like it basically as soon as they stopped expanding, and it was a much more, a very different concept in of itself than the one that existed in the West, even between the two empires, and there would be a lot to discuss, but let's leave it here. In the 9th century, there was even a further disgregation, right? The centrifugal forces in the Muslim world became more pressing, so that these greater imperial units fragmented themselves in turn in a series of sometimes even provincial governments held by emirs that are the equivalent of, let's say, the lesser sense of reges, right, in Latin. They're actually, again, some mostly military, intended as military commanders, the interior subjected to caliphal power. So it's something that, again, can't compare territorially. Think about Cordoba with even modern kingdoms, even to some extent, but within properly the Islamic concept, it's something different from the Christian kingdoms, and the interior. There's, generally speaking, a distrust in Islam towards this, say, the foundation of this emiral rule, when of course it is compared to the caliphal one. Also consider that in Islam there is no such thing like in Christendom, like in the separation of the priesthood and, say, lay government. So this entails many. It also explains, in some sense, the much greater instability of the Islamic world, among the other things, when compared to Christianity, when you look at political territorial entities. And indeed, at this point, these emirs had often a purely formal bond of subordination to Baghdad, and that truly becomes the real, say, governmental capital of Islam, even just by the splendor of its court and the general, cultural output. Also, of course, from the very wide Hellenic, Persian, say, pools of resources, right, scientifically, literary, and more. Some of these emirates, like, for example, the Aghlabids of Tunisia in the 9th century, were able to carry out autonomous conquests, such as famously the invasion of Byzantine Sicily, carried out by this de facto independent emirate of Cairouan in North Africa. And I made some videos about the Saracens. Never talked about the Aghlabides per se. Yes, I made a video about Islamic Sicily and Byzantine Sicily, so you can check those out if you're interested in the details. However, overall, like in the first half of the 10th century, this process of fragmentation of what had been the Islamic Empire accentuated even further, right? In part, this happened because of the general privatization, feudalization of these realities. When I say feudal, it's not to the degree of Western Europe that tops these world systems. Something happens with the Byzantine pronoia, as you know. Think about the Islamic iqtas, etc. The Turks, as Central Asian mercenaries newly converted to Islam, basically take over with some heavily feudal, often Persified, if you look at the Seljuks, of course, model, even in the following century, but here we're getting too far temporarily. The important being the crisis of Islam, especially in as much as the let's say the new antagonists, the new caliphates antagonizing with Baghdad were created in Egypt under the dynasty of the Fatimids in 910, and in Spain the aforementioned Umayyad Emirate evolving into the Caliphate of Cordoba in 929. So this final loss of unity that was evidently stemming also from the realization that there was no realistic political, strategical, or logistical capacity to ever bring back Islam together, had brought these rulers to claim the caliphal imperial rule on their own. Which is, again, something way more at some point the Westerners, for example, can reunite East and West, right? De facto they almost accomplish it, not just during the Fourth Crusade, but there were other useful chances. And still there is, in fact, a more subtle concept of what determines the Romanity of the empire and the church there. That's what really Islam missed in this, was to complicate things but making them sounder, as a matter of fact, which is an enormous spin-off for Western civilizational boost in these centuries. So you have the final expansionistic push of Islam as such, and in the originary concept of the Dar al-Islam, of truly of a unity. The Ottomans will try to do this, but it's lost under the grounds of what, in fact, these events, political and religious alike, had occurred during the Middle Ages. Some local governments, of course, kept being very important, but overall, those who were advantaged by this fragmentation, what we're talking about, this was primarily the Byzantines, right? And that's, in fact, why the Macedonian dynasty in many ways was so successful, because they were clever and capable to exploit this weakness, this sort of incoherence of these Muslim issues at the end of the day. Michael was still a kid, however, in the phases of these early conquests. It's important to stress that the Byzantines, up to that point, up to recently, had suffered significant defeats, pretty much close, to their boundaries. The Arabs had remained importantly on the offensive in spite of this gradual slowing down. Michael comes to power in 856, practically, through a veritable coup, through which he freed basically himself of his mother's tutelage. She was actually imprisoned, she was relegated. That's how both the Byzantines or the Carolingians used to do at this point, into a monastery together with the daughters, right? And Michael takes on power, absolute power, thanks, however, to the support of his aforementioned uncle Bardas, who kept, at this point, given Michael's youth, the main role of Byzantine ruler. In fact, the same uncle received in 862 from his nephew the rank of Caesar, and given this scarce propension of Michael the Third to government at this point, he managed to heavily influence him regarding basically all the aspects in the government of public life. The new regime brought, however, to a remarkable cultural revival in Constantinople. Right, this is an insight equally relevant as we can make it a parallelism with Islam, right? Given that this flourishing in Byzantine culture is in many ways lay. Technically, when we talk about Byzantine culture, there is no such thing like a lay one, right? Everything, literature, music, whatever, if it is not religious, is refused by the empire as its own, right? It does not exist, right? This would be an interesting aspect to analyze, but the point is that the iconoclasm that had brought so many divisions, internal fractures, etc., was still a relatively obscure moment. We actually don't know too much, at least we know these clashes occurred, but I had the pleasure of briefly cooperating with one of the greatest experts in the iconoclasm at university, and we had even a conference in this, and I had to illustrate his work, and I realized how much, made up, in a sense, that the entire, at least basic narrative of the iconoclasm was like, basically some people began to want to destroy icons just per se, and then they were crazy, and eventually they were put down, and it's over, right? It's not really what happened, right? But there is no doubt that on iconoclasm, very heavy suggestions from the caliphal power, that's the Muslim link, had manifested within the Byzantine world, again, also one of the darkest hours in the fight against the Arabs, right? So this coming back on the battlefield, as much as in this broader flourishing of Byzantine culture from the within, was a sort of watershed, right? As we were saying before, in the definition of what would eventually become Byzantine. It was strictly related to this conflict of universal nature. There had been more practical issues regarding education. The persecution of the iconoclasts had in fact brought higher education and the capital's university decaying. Right, for centuries, a famous center of juridical and literary studies like Constantinople had sharply decreased in its relevance. This is true for the empire as a whole, right? The empire had literally been halved territorially by the Islamic invasions, and the sense was that, again, when you suffered this, you are in a condition of pressure, depression, of lack of confidence, of inward sort of introverted attitude. You're not even willing, like, you don't have the spirit to keep on expanding. I mean, Byzantine culture is resilient, goes on, but the events of the previous centuries had sort of indicated, even in too many, let's say, free activities intellectually, as a sort of sin of pride, or too frivolous of an interest of some sort. At this point, there is almost the other extreme, right? There is an inversion under the reign of Michael III, and by the work of Bardas, you have the foundation of a university that became the center of profane culture of the time, which actually many Byzantines did not like, because they were much more stern and, against, again, the idea that anything imperial had to be beyond Christian culture. But evidently there were many energies, many potential and spiritual forces that were pressuring for the affirmation, also behind, of course, political interests. We'll see them now. The foundation of a new higher school institution that was established in the Imperial Magnaura Palace and put under the direction of the great mathematician Leo, known in fact as Leo the mathematician, but also the philosopher, that was one of the greatest scholars of the era. So much so that the very powerful Abbasid Caliph Al-Mamun, that was witnessing, in fact, under his rule, one of the greatest peaks of the so-called Golden Age of Islam, asked him, right, to move to Baghdad to teach the Abbasid court, right, and literally asking Constantinople, right. These were times of great cultural revival. In the West, you have the Carolingian Renaissance as well. You have actually a great contact between, for example, the Frankish court, the Abbasid one, as far as also the Byzantine policy was concerned in Mediterranean. There were many meeting points, and you can witness how advanced, like, scientific, technological, mechanical culture was in Abbasid times. If you look at their diplomatic gifts, for example, they had this magnificent water clocks they sent to Charlemagne. The Franks would send swords, horses. That was their thing, and so it's actually a moment of great reaching out, right, in these relations that, as we've seen, even among enemies or rivals or competitors, because there were also many things in between these empires, right? They're centers, and so was never at this point like a full, like, everybody versus everybody, like before. But this just to express how relevant could it be to have such a great scholar in these universal course of real ecumenic ambition, right? In the University of Constantinople, you could find at this point, if objectively, some of the greatest scientists of the time, and this encompassed probably the entire sphere of knowledge, right? All the various branches. Subject, the Byzantines had quite an encyclopedistic mindset. They cared about, let's say, affirming their own totality, that their universal power, in fact, the contemplation of the world entire. This was what essentially all these great empires were trying to do in their own way, right? The Muslims were a bit more self-referential. The Franks were a bit rougher, focusing just mostly on some ideological issues. But this is not even the complete picture. I made some videos about, for example, the Carolingian Renaissance, explaining this as far as the scholars, the manuscripts, the philosophies, etc. were present at this point, without mentioning there were heresies around. The same Al-Mamun, as we were saying before, was actually fostering some Shia, even conversion of the caliphate at that point. It eventually failed because of internal clashes within Baghdad, but otherwise it could have happened, right? Just think how history would have changed at that point. However, coming back to Constantinople, the future patriarch Photius was one of the scholars here. Now, this figure is quite important, as you know, because it brought to a schism that is sort of the prelude to the Great One, right, of 1081, that we discussed in some recent Byzantine history video, right, to break the deterioration of the relations with Rome, the Roman papacy that at this point had basically passed over to the Carolingians. Not fully, like, right, there was always a very strong sense that Rome was part of, in theory at least, of the Byzantine Empire, but at this point some Byzantine historians say it quite openly. I also made a video explaining that. let's say, in the moment in which Louis the Pious, Charlemagne had affirmed, especially at least initially, also the capacity of interfering with the papal election, etc. Rome was lost, right? That's when the Byzantines rationalized this, because you think about that, up to that point, nobody had really, like, Rome had never been conquered by anyone, right? It was theoretically still part of the empire. In any case, Photius, his life spans between, we don't know the dates exactly, but something around 810, 893. He was the grand nephew of the Patriarch Tarasius, Saint Tarasius, by the way. And the main problem with Photius that would create resistance, because this was a man of the Magnaura school, right? So remember, it was going against what was the more conservative Byzantine Orthodox clergy, right? And he was a controversial figure because before his election to the Patriarchate of Constantinople, he had been just a civil servant. He had occupied the office of Protoasecretis. That was a hell of a post, by the way. It was essentially the high functionary that directed the imperial chancery, right? And his promotion to the patriarchal throne was in fact wanted by Bardas. At this point, so he's fully backed by the imperial power. And Bardas was the enemy of Patriarch Ignatius. There's a very interesting figure because this guy was actually the son of the former Byzantine Emperor Michael I Ragade, who had, in virtue, in fact, of this ascendancy, extradited from power, castrated, so that he was physically unfit to succeed the throne. He had become a monk as a consequence, and he had remained, of course, pretty much triggered by this, to say the least. He had to take on, in fact, this intransigent positions close to the zealots and hostile, in fact, to Bardas' policy, with whom had entered in full conflict. And up to Michael's mother regency, like, he had actually been protected by her, but after Bardas came into power, he was essentially kicked out of the court. And Photius had other qualities, as you understand, aside from the bit of a political one. He had, for example, a literary fame that is connected especially with the so-called bibliothèque, that is a long series of chapters that contain news and extracts of works read by Photius. We're talking 729 codices that, as they are at least commonly defined philologically, that have to do mostly with religious but also profane works, stemming from the classical era to the Byzantine one. This was a bit typical of Byzantine culture. As you know, like, the idea is that, yes, true imperial culture, as we've seen, is Christian, but since Constantine's times, the Byzantine civil servants have in the administration to read things like the Iliad, the Odyssey, etc. It's actually a compact. I mean, at this point, back in Constantine's times, it was not a great education, right? Telling the truth, it was very compact, standardized, etc., just to have people who knew how to handle certain things. It was not so high, at least, as one of the great senators that, especially in Constantine's times, did not really exist. The best ones were the Romano-Italic ones back in the day. But at this point, of course, we're talking about a much more stratified society in which knowing all these works really makes for, as we were saying before, like a universal education of some sort, an unprejudiced mind. And Photius is definitely, in fact, not just a political, but a literary figure in his own regard, right? And this collection of his is quite interesting because it shows not just some, it allows philologically at least to reconstruct some works that have been lost. There are excerpts, as we were saying before, and we know something about works that otherwise are lost. But it also shows, generally speaking, what was the mentality of the time, what was the main interest of these people that could clash now, as we will see, also with international universal authorities at a spiritual, theological level. Well, Photius rose to the patriarchal throne of Constantinople in 858. This naturally caused, and immediately so, a great opposition from the side of Ignatius' party, and in which the Roman popes decided to interfere. As we were just saying, the papacy had made its field choice recently. It's fair to say that until the 12th century, again, the popes were okay with the idea of literally controlling both empires, like a sort of an east and a west. But there is no doubt that Rome fit, more broadly speaking, in the Western system. Tensions had been going on with Constantinople. I mean, the Byzantine emperors at the point had tried to have popes killed and had also succeeded. I mean, the really dark stories, like none of this actually is to be seen in the Western Church, that was also candidly orthodox compared to, but really in general, like in absolute terms, when you look at the Byzantines, their compromise with monophysitism, monothelitism, all the whole iconoclast stuff, that was horrifying, to say the least. They had different issues. They were, of course, doing that for quite pragmatic political reasons, but they were also offensive towards the West. In Italy, for example, many monasteries that the Roman Church had also ideally, kept controlling, had been ravaged by the Byzantines because they needed to cash. This was part of the iconoclastic implications, but not only. In a sense here is that the popes understand what's going on in Constantinople. They're not too happy themselves about this flourishing of lay culture, the sort of this dissolute lifestyle of Michael III, who has actually lots of interesting affairs, including with the daughter of the Varangian Guard leader of Constantinople. That's beautiful. The same Emperor Leo VI was possibly the consequence of this union. We made a video about him. But in general, there is this sense that let's say the fact that the conservative clergy of Constantinople is being beaten by the sort of new lay figures, including this civilian rise into the patriarchate as Photius, that is also quite intellectually and prejudiced, etc., is at least a good chance to beat a bit the same, let's say, control, put in crisis a bit the Byzantine authorities to make it become somewhat more dependent on the same Rome. It could have spanned this in its own, say, boundaries. I made a video about, it's not exactly the same time, but Rome under the reign of Charles III, the last of the Carolingian, that exemplifies how internationally intertwined, not just the papacy, but the Roman nobility really were at this point, and more. So the papacy decides to intervene and to especially oppose the election of Photius to the patriarchate, openly deeming it to be legitimate. Given that it was really, they were right, a layman imposed by Bardas, from which the previous patriarch had been obliged to renounce the throne, and he would back, in fact, that faction of the Byzantine Church that was opposed to Bardas. Photius, with the support by Michael and his uncle, so just the greatest authorities in the empire, and so to an important degree internationally. And he was in fact headed straight against the Pope Nicholas I, who in 861, out of all these issues, declared him deposed. Right. Michael III at this point kept supporting Photius. He actually, it's a very complex topic. I surely have to make a video not just about the Photian schism, but in general, like how the church worked, say in the 9th century, like how still Constantinople was seen as the center, of course, of a broader empire, how much politics, also the areas as that you wouldn't expect, like there were some, clergymen from the Islamic controlled areas, since, like for example, Sicily, right, that still went to Constantinople and had at the same time contacts with the papacy in the north, and so all this was just a huge political cauldron, right, in which these guys would throw literally everything. For example, at this point, Michael opposes the Roman claim that, however, had historically been accepted by the same Constantinople of the religious primacy, right, the primacy of charity of Rome. The sense was that the Pope could not really tell what the Patriarchate of Constantinople could or couldn't do, not even the emperors. It was all the Caesar papistic ideal. Instead, in the West, we were already to the point, in fact, of considering the papal and the imperials already on a different ground. So it's really a difference in culture, in mentality, in language. You would think that is not much of an issue, but actually, these were different countries, different peoples that were quarreling over major universal stakes. And he attacked, the Tolkien Photius and Michael altogether attacked the Church of Rome on the doctrinal level, right? So this was particularly annoying for the papacy, and it brought this issue to the extreme consequences. Theologically speaking, they go Scarface, final kind of mode, and from both sides. And synod convened in Constantinople in 867, famously enough, excommunicated the same pope, which was, a bit just ridiculous if it hadn't been, again, functional to the internal Byzantine policy, because, again, this was not just about what the Byzantines said to the outer world. It was literally the point that there was a major faction in Constantinople that represented, as we've seen, this enormous legacy of conservatism that was handed by the unjustly the throne ousted descendant of the same Byzantine emperor that was in fact taken out by the current regime, and it was a way to display power, to say, oh look, we can excommunicate the same popes of Rome, who are these people, we're cooler now, we have sort of more culture than them, or at least we think so, because we want to do what we want, and it's all this internal faction fault to if they still just think that there can be only one way of doing things. So it's pretty messed up, right? This synod used as the excuse for the excommunication the condemnation as heretical of the famous Roman doctrine of the double procession of the Holy Ghost, so the filioque, right, from the Father and from the Son, right. The diciture in Latin would be the Holy Ghost, ex patre per filium procedit, which means that, of course, Jesus is a medium. Just like we made many videos about the sacred royalty and how this was meant to work, and in part out of ignorance, the West had objectively mistranslated this, not ex patre per filium, but ex patre filioque. That is to say, putting on the same level the Father and the Son in this function, which theoretically is not. In fact, it still exists in the Catholic magisterium today that accepts both the ex parte per filium and the filioque, because objectively it's the same thing. I mean, not just let's say, of course, there is a divinity in Christ, but and so the Holy Ghost does stem from Him, right? But it depends also in which context, of course, in the biblical scripture, and you can. It's not wrong, right? If you want to make it really, clear, like that's something that the Catholics maintain because it doesn't go against objectively what was this more, harmonic sense of the Trinity, right, with a differentiated role, right? But this was apparently taken as an excuse by you see here, not even the single most theologically intransigent party in Constantinople was the other one, and that part surely had something against the papacy, but at that moment as well, but in that moment was creating, was just in the position of supporting the same papacy. There was all a grievance against the Roman intrusions that were rejected as illegal as far as the Byzantine church affairs were concerned. So you understand here that there is an attitude. You see, you have never seen, say, 300 years before. 300 years before, that there was a much more outlined face of a single empire, and so no actual theological opposition to this recognized actual Roman primacy and the general sense that the empire was one. At this point, you have the Byzantines acting essentially as a different country against the papacy as almost another entity that it technically was. I mean, that it, de facto was. In spite of, again, the idea that still Rome belonged to the empire ideally, at least the Byzantine one, even though there was also a Carolingian one, interestingly enough. So, and all this, again, with the problems between the Carolingians and the Byzantines in Italy, the competition against the Muslims that had taken the control of some coast cities, important cities in southern Italy, in the competition for recovering them. So it's really that messed up, and that's why we will make surely a much better dedicated video to the Photian schism. And that wasn't really one, right? The true, say, not even the great one in the 11th century was considered as such, right? These were sort of quarrels that contributed to strain the already turbulent relations between Rome and Constantinople that, however, at some point later were never recomposed. Like the 11th century Great Schism wasn't meant, they didn't sit at a table, okay, say, now forever we're separated from the Church of Rome as a distant. No, right? This did not enter. It just came to happen to be like sort of the point of non-return, because later there were actually ways to reunite the churches, the debates on it, also in relatively recent time, say in the time of Manuel Comnenus, with the attempt at the reconquest of southern Italy from the Normans. The popes were open to that. So you see, it's not definitive, but definitely Photius schism is one important step towards that direction. And again, to an unprecedented degree, that matches that, again, stepping further, that sort of coming back of the empire that now had to take some stronger stand and came to impact the Roman Church for how it had just been developing its prerogatives and also united with the Franks and more, right? But also, and evidently, these internal issues, right? And actually, something more serious could have further escalated if Michael hadn't been deposed and the following emperor changed immediately. The religious policy of the empire and sort of recompose, in fact, this world, right? But you see, things could have broken further even before, and they were pretty much Bardas was taken out. Right, today we do not see it completely. I talk about this, I think, in the video about Basil the First, that in fact illustrates also the various problems of the succession of the same fatherly connections were an issue, etc. But Bardas was accused of plotting against the Saint Michael by another leader who essentially was allowed to kill the Saint Bardas, and eventually Michael was assassinated himself. But speaking of his reign, and we've seen it definitely in other dedicated videos already, we observed the intense missionary activity carried out by the Byzantines at this point. And speaking of, you see how all the topics reconnect themselves, like of the rivalry with Rome, was struggling actually to compete with the evangelization of Europe, right? The Carolingians, the papacy, were closer to peoples like the Scandinavians, the Western Slavs, that were essentially starting to gravitate around, in a way or another, cooperatively or uncooperatively, but on the longer run for good, around, in fact, Frankish Roman Europe. And the Byzantines, I made a video, specifically one on the evangelization of Moravia and Khazaria, remain mostly cut off from this dynamic. At least they get the worst areas of Europe. So they succeed in the Balkan hinterlands and Eastern Europe, but these areas are nothing compared to what essentially the Roman Church with the Carolingians were able to carry out in the following, the Carolingians and, say, the Ottonians, for example, in the following centuries. But the evangelization effort of the Byzantines is quite strong, especially among the Slavs, right? Moravia, I made a video about Great Moravia. There is an ambiguity at this point regarding what was actually Great Moravia. If the area, let's say, in today's Slovakian Czech Republic, or actually a Serbian Moravia, or at least one that gravitated around Belgrade, and that at that time was still connected with the Western Slavs, because the Avars had been destroyed and the Magyars had not settled yet in the Carpathian Basin to separate those peoples yet again. The other major target of the Byzantine evangelization at this point was naturally the First Bulgarian Empire. Made multiple videos on all these topics. And the Christianization of these peoples had a great political meaning, besides the religious one, because for many reasons, through, for example, the organization of a new local church, the fact that you had an extension of Byzantine control beyond the boundaries of the empire. To make the long story short, we'll see now more technically what it meant. The acceptance of Christianity in the Byzantine version, that now was informally growing different from the Roman one. This is the interesting thing. Technically, Christianity is still one, right? And again, even after the 11th century, there's no such thing. Okay, like now we have the Catholics and the Orthodox. Those are two terms that are continuously abused. Catholic was the name of the church since its foundation, if you know what Catholic means. Orthodox was also just the obvious adjective that, it was an orthodoxy doctrinally, theologically wise. So actually, these are purely conventional terms, but nobody was thinking about an actual religious schism, as we were saying before, on a real theological ground. You could find the guys who were wrong, but not the will to claim that there was an entire Christendom that was separating, because that would have been literally against your own purpose, right? You could blame this or that guy, the papacy, the Patriarch of Constantinople, but you would never point at alienating an entire chunk of Christendom just per se. And that's in fact the actual issue that was pointed out before. Naturally, when you look at Central Eastern Europe, you find still pagan peoples, right? So these are a virgin soil as far as the affirmation of an actual ecclesiastical administration that would obviously be modeled on the sedentary ecclesiastical order that would bring to political organization, would connect you with whomever had provided you with that model in the first place. So winning over these peoples meant to have a sphere of influence over them that would strip them fundamentally from the orbit of the rival opponent. In this, I would say that Rome had been much more successful in the previous centuries than Constantinople. The West had been objectively also more tranquil in general regarding these affairs, but it was probably the Roman model of spirituality that won over, especially the Italian, Frankish, Anglo-Saxon axis that was remaining quite strong. Now also the Spanish, after the Islamic conquest, what was left of the Christian domains was essentially turning towards Rome, because previously, as you know, with Toledo, they had been going on their own third way compared to Rome and Constantinople. Constantinople had to essentially save its skin. There were lots of Christians in the Levant, and that was actually what they were in part fighting for as well. But as you know, things went differently, and even though the Byzantines always tried to reconquer and even succeeding at some point, at least Antioch and even Jerusalem, ideally, together with pretty much what had belonged historically to the Roman Empire, they had sort of missed the opportunity to create some connections with other parts of Europe. Admittedly, of course, if let's say the fact that peoples like the Moravians or the Bulgarians were Christianized, more concretely, also later the Rus, right? At this point, it's because it was time for them to do so. So the Byzantines admittedly couldn't quite do it before with much convenience and or without resistance, for example. So it was clever from the Byzantines just to concentrate on the East. It made a lot of sense. They had many more cards to play. They were not particularly good, as we've seen with the Westerners. Historically, they disrespected the papacy in so many ways. They had probably a different mentality of what the church had to be. That is fully subordinated to the emperor, and to the point that the emperor is the actual head of the church in earthly terms. Right? Let's put it in this way. There is a lot of ambiguity regarding that. We'll talk about it because the Byzantines did maintain a concept of, think about the concept of Sevastocrator, right? Of actual Christomimesis. So the church, it's as if they had been at the head of the church themselves to some extent. And they had been the actual vicars of Christ, as opposed to the papacy that, of course, was stressing how the church does not belong to this world, and so at least as far as the offices were concerned, like the imperial one is just one of human protection over this earthly community. But it's at the end of which, however, is Christ and the Pope, at least as his vicar on earth. Let's skip this because this is all very important food for thought for other videos as well. But to make the long story short, of course, there had to be some eventual conversion of these peoples, and the Byzantines had to think how to make the most of it, especially when there was such an effective Latin Germanic Europe that was pretty much evangelizing everyone around it. There was, of course, in this Byzantine version, the acceptance of the recognition of the moral supremacy of the Emperor of Constantinople over the local affairs, that, as we just said, was considered as all one with the Church. This caused some ambiguities. I made a video about Rastislav, the sovereign of Great Moravia in this case. We talked about Boris I of Bulgaria. We talked about Olya of Kiev. In 862, this Moravian ruler came closer to Constantinople for actually not so strictly religious reasons. I mean, he was pressured by the Carolingians, and there had been ups and downs in this relations. At least the Western Slavs had been pressured by the Franks historically, but they were evidently also within that orbit inescapably. But siding, and this was an incredibly complicated quadrangle in which you find the Carolingians, the Moravians, the Bulgarians, and Constantinople, plus the papacy as well. They all pursue some different goals, most often, of course, aligning one with the other. But you have, I don't know, at some point now the Moravians that support the Bulgarians against the Byzantines, and now instead ask for help of the Byzantines, and it's all a total mess, right? In fact, we don't have time to digress. But at this point, given that Rastislav was pressured by the Franks, the sovereign, the Moravian sovereign, asked for the empire, for the arrival of a Christian mission to evangelize his people, and momentously enough, in especially Slavic history, in a Slavonic written language, and also spoken by. Of course, this was entailing, again, together with the affirmation of an ecclesiastical administration, a permanent asset to be founded, writing a complete change that would hopefully help the local rulers to centralize more power, which would happen, but eventually not under Constantinople. And this occurred under Michael's reign. The emperor decided to respond because it was important to at least project the Byzantine religious influence as far as Moravia, to try to encompass a bit everything it was in between, and trying to keep the Franks out of the core. The emperor chooses two brothers from Thessaloniki, that is a frontier area with the Slavic world, and of course the Byzantine one, the famous Constantine and Methodius. The first one was a ecclesiastical dignitary of the same Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Perhaps he taught philosophy in the same Magnaura University in the capital. So we're talking here definitely figures of high caliber, also because what they managed to achieve. Methodius was instead a monk from the community of the Olympus in Bithynia. And so there's a lot of geography and tradition and legend, but to make the long story short, Constantine is credited with the creation of a Slavonic alphabet, Slavonic script, known as Glagolitic, which comes from the Slavic verb glagolati, which means to speak. This would be supplanted by Cyrillic later, but essentially the first stem from the other, and it dates back to the Moravian mission of evangelization. Cyrillic, by the way, is the term that stems from the name that the same Constantine took on when he retired to a monastic life. They changed their name. And so the same Cyrillus at that point translated the Bible in Slavonic, together with other ecclesiastical texts that would in fact constitute the doctrinal basis of Moravian Christianity. And this is fascinating because of the enormous work of expression. I mean, how do you translate these from Greek, from Latin? By the way, this mission was very close to Rome as well. Right, at some point, Constantine and Methodius went to Rome with some converted Slavs. There were beautiful processions in the same Rome, because the popes were essentially very involved into, especially the Western Balkans, well, actually in the Balkans and Central European affairs through the same evangelization. So at this point they still cooperated with Constantinople ideally. Again, there wasn't a total fracture. And that's why I say it's a very complex topic, because you can't quite resume it so quickly, given all these implications. It goes really step by step. But the most important aspect, arguably, also of this translation is that this is the first witness of a Slavic literary language, and the way it had been conceptually expressed from the translation. Eventually Moravia would be won over by the Roman Church. Bulgaria has a different history, because the First Bulgarian Empire was sort of unavoidably, just like the Moravians were unavoidably within the Carolingian sphere, so the Bulgarians were in the Byzantine one. But, as you know, the First Bulgarian Empire was very powerful, was a hell of of an empire in its own regard, at least, was the weaker of the two, and it was weaker than the Carolingians, but spatially it covered this vast areas in these critical territories that were to be converted, including the same Bulgaria that's next door to Constantinople, and it had a massive political and strategic relevance. At some point, the Bulgarians, for this reason, had thought that they could convert actually to Roman Christianity. In other words, to let the Pope do that work of conversion, to trigger the Byzantines. And there were lots of backs and forth in this regard, but again, the Bulgarians could not quite, escape the Byzantine gravitational attraction, and they're obviously dependent on it. They can't also be at war constantly with it. So they developed rather the idea of becoming a sort of copy of Constantinople, at least their own weird way of thinking it. And I say weird because, of course, there were lots of problems in doing so, but they were a real threat, militarily speaking, that wouldn't be eradicated, in fact, until the early 11th century. So that the Bulgarians initially, after having initially turned to the Franks, they were converted to the Orthodox faith, we can so call it, by the Byzantine missionaries, and their Tsar, that of course mimicked the title of Caesar, Boris, received his baptism in 864. Again, I made a video about both Rastislav and Boris together with Oleh of Kiev, so it talks about all these various. I made other Byzantine history videos speaking of how the Rusian conversion occurred instead. They had it all different, alright, but the important thing is that these peoples, the Bulgarians and the Rusians, would fall into the Byzantine sphere of influence still to this day through the Orthodox rite that define their own identities, their own cultures. So immediately after this Bulgarian conversion, the Greek, the Byzantine clergy carried on in organizing the Bulgarian church. It was again difficult because, as we explained countless times, Bulgaria is not the Byzantine world, which is essentially a urban coastal one. I can't stress enough how much Greekness was inherited historically by the Byzantines to become so, as opposed to Romans, in the sort of maritime, sort of thalassocratic tendency, and the complete lack of interest towards the interland, because those were barbarians in the typical Hellenic mindset. Extremely different for how the Latins, for example, so that this influenced dramatically the way, for example, the Roman Church developed in the West, which is also much more successful way. The Bulgarians had barely any city on their own. They were a much more continental, rural reality than the much bulkier infrastructural and statal like Constantinople. But they had this great, in fact, civilizational output next door, and the geographical proximity helped. Right, there was a dangerous symbiosis. The Bulgarians were always this looming threat over Constantinople, or at least the Theodosian walls were enough, together with the general structure of the empire, to escape the menace, let's say. And this brought to also some resistance internally to Bulgaria, because of course the affirmation of a Bulgarian church meant more powerful elites, and especially more powerful monarchy, and the demand to subject to Constantinople, just as if Bulgaria now was taken over by the Byzantine Empire just by having been converted by it, of course brought Boris to refuse and to actually ask an autonomous patriarchate, so a sort of twin one of Constantinople, together with the Tsar Caesar title, mirrored, and not having received it, he turned to Pope Nicholas I. This was one of the turns that brought the Bulgarians close to Rome, and it was also, in fact, one of the reasons of the contrast that, as you see here, in just 3 years before, 3 years after, at least Boris' baptism would bring to the Photian issue, right? All the anti-Roman policy, etc. The popes were pretty much involved and interested in Bulgaria, also because, again, it was huge. So if you want that over, you want an entire chunk of southern and central Europe, that even partly Eastern Europe, that would have been quite a thorn in the side, not to say else, for Constantinople, as it already was, at least as far as the Bulgarian military, I made a video about this just the other day, was concerned. But at least the situation would be resolved 3 years after the Synod of Photius in 870, in which the Bulgarian delegates arriving to Constantinople finally accepted to at least be under the Byzantine Church, administratively speaking, in exchange, however, for the recognition of a Bulgarian archbishop. Right, so the Constantinopolitan Patriarchate was acting as a sort of above. You see, this is the of course the hypocrisy of the Byzantines. Of course, they were denying the Roman primacy of charity and of honor that was at the root, probably, of Christian identity. But as far as saying, no, Rome is not superior to anyone, we shouldn't accept. But then, of course, with these other peoples, of course, they had to be subjected to the Patriarchate of Constantinople, that itself had nothing, had not even been founded by an apostle, differently from other, not just from Rome, but say from Alexandria, from Jerusalem, from Antioch, and so it's pretty. It highlights all the problems and the issues that the Byzantines had. I mean, you gotta understand them. They were so much pressured constantly, so that they had necessarily, out of instinct of survival, I would say, and not just political pragmatism, to accept, to develop a different system, right? Even though it was pretty ruthless, telling the truth, and sort of not really paranoid, but pretty inward, pretty uncompromising. So the Bulgarians obtained also some bishops that were consecrated in Constantinople. They were thus formally depending on the local patriarchate, but again, they had their own operational autonomy, because even if the Byzantines had wanted to control them directly, they would have not succeeded, because the First Bulgarian Empire was independent, and it doesn't matter how close to the Byzantines they were and how ambiguous they were in that symbiosis that they were searching for, they were still a different power, right? And one that, yes, would remain within that orbit, but never quite, not even after it was crushed by Basil II, it was like directly, fully conquered, ruled over. Like it was always sort of a culturally distant province, despite of being a geographically close one. So this was a bit the reign of Michael III. You understand he's a bit of a strange figure to some extent, but he was not really that bad as it sounds. I mean, he was just doing what you would imagine like a calculating, rational mind would do in those circumstances. Surely there were some failures in all this, including his demise, but he was like a cold, calculating, scrupulous individual. Like, he was not that really passive thing just because of Bardas, etc. He was part of a system now that, in fact, with this Macedonian dynasty, like, that starts from after him fully, but say he's included, right? If you are confused about the beginning, in as much as it inaugurated this new phase that the Macedonian world affirms itself from, aside from the various problems, affiliations, etc. But he began the dynasty as well as a person, so it's both, really. Alright, there would be always a lot to tell. You understand how complex and complicated the whole story is, so I go emperor by emperor and then I come back on these topics individually, because otherwise one gets lost. It has to be quite, categorical, has to analyze thing by thing, one after another. I still feel like Schwerpunkt has just not even began to start its introduction, right? So after thousands of videos, I think that still, so honestly, I think like that, because it always feels like these are new topics and that are never fully covered. They can't, we have to look at other things, and I really mean that, right? For today, however, I stop it here. We will go on with the series of the Byzantine emperors. Individually, it's the only way really you can study the history of Constantinople. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.